None of us took advantage of fancy Zoom backgrounds.
Mm-hmm. I think someone I know, Matthew, asked if we should ask questions throughout. You can just type in questions throughout, and then I think we'll take them at the end. I think if they're relevant during, I think Alicia can help us. We can monitor the Q&A and answer as we go too.
Yep, absolutely.
Okay. Looks like we're at 3:01 and we have a good number of people here. So we'll just have others come in and join when they can. And we'll get started. So hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alicia. I'm a co-founder at Fraction.
Oh, sorry, Alicia. Before you, should we hit the record?
It's recording.
Oh, nice.
Oh, it is?
Oh, we are recording.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. Mine makes it look like it's not. Sorry.
It's okay. We'll cut it out. Okay. Anyway, like I said, my name is Alicia and I'm a co-founder at Fraction, and I'm also today's moderator for our webinar discussion on the features Fractional, how part-time developers can drive startup growth. I'm excited to be part of today's conversation and to introduce you to our two panelists, Praveen Ghanta and Ernie Park. So we'll go ahead and get started. Ernie, you can go ahead and share a bit about yourself and your background.
Yeah, thanks, Alicia. Hey, everyone. I'm Ernie Park. I'm coming to you from the great state of New Jersey. I guess professionally, I've had like a pretty cookie cutter career for the most part until more recently. So studied computer science at MIT. I did a startup backed by Y Combinator right after school, and I put the YC logo there, not the startup because it didn't go very far. And most of my career was really built at HubSpot, where I was an engineer, an engineering manager. And then I was at Brex for a little bit. But I can kind of go more into the story later, I guess. But basically, I sort of burnt out, left my job in 2021 amidst the pandemic and everything, and kind of discovered part-time fractional work sort of by chance. Started a little farm, got featured in the Wall Street Journal. So there's me holding my chicken. But yeah, started this newsletter, Part-Time Tech, and I've really enjoyed kind of exploring all aspects of part-time fractional work, how we can empower workers, but also like why it's useful for businesses as well, right? Like it's like such an untapped kind of market of great talent and people and matching the way people want to work. So I've just had a great time the last 6-7 months exploring that, and been working on that as part of the newsletter and exploring kind of other opportunities related to that. I can kick it off to Praveen.
Awesome. Thanks, Ernie. And my name is Praveen Ghanta, and I also am an MIT computer science person. So Ernie and I I think we connected over, I'm not sure if it was through an MIT kind of direct connection or not, but or maybe it was just through fractional work.
Yeah.
My background, actually, I think I have worked for a few years in corporate roles, but mostly either been a founder or freelance consultant. And we'll certainly share that story in more detail, but kind of background wise, I started my career at the tail end of the .com bubble, and so jumped right into startup land and had a little bit of success there. Watched my company, or the company I founded, get acquired, and made a teensy bit of money on that, but then found the shares, which we thought they were going to be worth like $1 million, and we were going to IPO. I think I sold them for around $400. So, different outcome, a nice dinner's worth, but an early education in how startups can go. And later in my career, I spent time, while I was a software developer at big companies, doing fractional work, so being a fractional developer, and I sat in those shoes. And then when I founded the company HiddenLevers around 2010, which was a startup I ran for a bit over a decade, I then hired fractional developers, and it worked so well in building, my own startup up from, just my co-founder and I on up to a team of about 30, at exit, and a good chunk of those, were fractional. That, post-exit, it occurred to me that, that was actually a really good model. Can we make a company out of that? And so we'll definitely talk to you all about more about that. But that's where I am today as one of the co-founders of Fraction. And that picture there is it looks like I'm breaking in. That's escaping from SaaStr last fall. We couldn't find the exit, so you can see I have the badge on. So apparently I was there for real.
Awesome, cool. So it sounds like you both have had some extensive experience, obviously in tech and with fractional work. Praveen, do you mind sharing a bit more about your experience with that and your story there?
Sure. So HiddenLevers started in 2010, and we sold software to financial advisors. Specifically, it was a SaaS-based platform. We sold portfolio stress testing software. So we would answer questions that financial advisors would use the software to answer questions like, what will happen to my retirement savings if the Fed keeps on hiking interest rates, or what will happen, to my investments, like maybe it'll be positive if we don't have a recession. So positive and negative macroeconomic scenarios and projecting how that might impact investments. So built that company starting, so we bootstrapped, and my co-founder and I, we were the original team, just the two of us. Once we started to find some product market fit and get some customers, get some money in the door, from revenue, pretty soon it was more than I alone could build in terms of software. So I went back to that idea that I had from doing it myself. I thought, I've got friends at big companies that I know they're bored. I know that they've got capacity. Can I just hire them to help work on this software? And so that's exactly what we ended up doing. Our CTO actually started fractionally with us, somebody that I knew from before. And one of our longest tenured developers started fractionally with us relatively early on, and he stayed with us for almost 9 years. And the CTO stayed with us through exit. In the case of our CTO, he started fractionally and became full-time. In the case of Sohail, who was one of the fractional developers in the first of 5, he stayed fractional throughout, like I said, for almost 9 years. So one of the things that we learned in that experience was that fractional or even part-time doesn't mean temporary. It can be an open-ended engagement, just and long-term just as much as full-time work. And we realized that we could really cover a lot of bases. It was 40%. So 5 of our 12 developers were fractional when we sold the company in 2021. And clearly the acquirer even thought that the model worked a bit because they kept on some of those folks who are still there in a fractional capacity. So it was successful enough, in using that model. You see the number perhaps on the slide, $600,000 a year is what we estimate we were saving by the end through the use of fractional developers. But from the developers' perspective, they were also making additional income. So it really worked for both sides. And that was what, really compelled me to consider trying to start a company to bring this concept to other startups and other growth companies.
Great. Awesome. Thanks for sharing. So Ernie, can we hear a bit more from you on your experience and background?
Yeah, so mine's a little bit different. Middle of last year, I was sort of like working on my farm, kind of not really knowing what I was doing with my life. But a past coworker who was a VP at HubSpot had been advising this company called Arcade, which just like a quick plug, they basically build software to help like gamify, incentivize sales teams, but also just generally make kind of work more fun, basically, right? Especially in the remote world, it's kind of a much bigger thing, and to keep your employees engaged and all that. So anyways, he was helping them sort of on the go-to-market side, and they had a bit of a gap on the engineering side. Their sort of product engineering leader was leaving for whatever reason, and they just needed someone kind of in the seat who could really help them work with the CEO and just make sure the team was in a good place. So I kind of took the role. So you can hop to the next slide there, Alicia, but I took a fractional interim role. So this started last June. And the great thing, at least for me personally, was my second baby was due January 1st of 2023. So I timed this so I knew it would end right, kind of like before the holidays. So it was going to be 6 months. I was doing about 10 hours a week. And that's typo, I should say 1/3 salary, but I was getting basically 1/3 of the salary I would if I was working this full time, and a little bit of equity. So really good.
I was going to say, that's really sweet. Ernie, you were
Yeah.
making 4x, but even
Yeah, yeah.
even 1/3 is great.
Yeah, no, well, 1/3 was still very good. Obviously no benefits, but a third of the salary, and so cost savings on an absolute basis for the company, but I was still able to kind of jump in there. And it was really eye-opening for me. So there were actually 3 of us fractionally who were leaders. 2 of us were on the engineering side, 1 actually on the kind of product go-to-market side. But the company was sort of at an inflection point, and when we came in, I did some coaching for some of the more junior folks. I really helped think about, like, how does engineering fit into the actual business strategy, generally improving engineering culture. I hired a bunch, including finding my replacement, right, which was kind of ultimately the goal for the long term. Yeah, and it was really a fantastic engagement. I learned a ton personally, and I feel like I left the company in a much better place than when I joined it. And they were able to do it super cost effectively, right? And they wouldn't have been able to hire someone like me. I don't say this because I'm a hotshot or something, but like I just wasn't on the market for a full-time job, right? And it was like a very niche thing, but I took it because it was fractional. It fit my lifestyle and it fit my skills. So that was like really eye-opening for me, and it really worked for everybody. I think they were able to hire me and turn me around before the person I was replacing even left, right? Which you wouldn't have been able to do with like a full-time search, but through the kind of this network, I was able to go in there quickly, help the team, help them improve, and then set them up for long-term success as well. So yeah, this was really a fantastic engagement. I think a win-win really for me and the company, and really opened my eyes to like, hey, this should exist in more contexts and can be really valuable for companies.
Right. And actually, Ernie, that's so you mentioned something I don't think that I realized, which is that there were multiple fractional kind of leaders at Arcade. And so was there
Yeah.
something about Arcade's background or just where they were at that led them to that approach? Or
Yeah, good question. The big thing is that they're sort of at an inflection point in their strategy and like where they were kind of going as a company. So basically um I think it was they're basically switching more to like a more traditional SaaS model, whereas
Mhm.
before they were SaaS, but like in sort of different markets. So it required people who had seen kind of this story before, and it actually ended up just through our network being like 3 ex HubSpot people. The other
Oh,
person
okay.
was, yeah, like I said, go to market and sales, and then the other was actually she used to be my manager at HubSpot, but he was more he was less time than me, but more just like technical advisory on some like very deep technical topics. And so that kind of team there, talk about
Mhm.
teams, was actually really,
Right.
really valuable because we worked together as like a leadership team. And we're able to bring our expertise that we had seen at a company that
Mhm.
was further along and bring some of those lessons and adapt it to the context of this startup.
Right. And actually, what you were mentioning about the fact that you were not looking for a job and you weren't on the traditional job market. I think that's like really a key point that we see as well, which is that so even now, so there have been some layoffs in the industry, in the tech industry, and so there's starting to maybe be a few people available, but there's so much demand that there's also just kind of a lot of folks are finding where they want to go next. Um, at any given time, generally speaking, it's only around 2% of the developer or tech, frankly, broader than that, tech kind of workforce that is on the open market. And so
Yeah.
um, if you're sort of recruiting as a company and you're looking at 2% of available, potential talent. Whereas when Ernie, to your point, whenever you can look and talk to folks who are maybe otherwise engaged or maybe want something different, and certainly this is what we see with our model, is that yeah, you can talk to 50 times the number of people. So the potentiality there is just so much higher. And also the fact that in your case there was no start time, right? Because you kind of, you're like, hey, yeah, this works for me, I can start tomorrow, I don't need to like quit anything.
Yeah,
So
absolutely. There's like a ton of benefits there. And yeah, like ask any recruiter, right? It's like always about timing, and like it doesn't matter whether they're on market, you kind of like keep pestering them. But a lot of these folks who want to work fractionally part-time, it's they're a lot more kind of available there. And I think you're going to have a higher hit rate finding people with like the exact kind of expertise that you need. So
Great, awesome. Thank you both for sharing a bit more on your experience there. But I kind of wanted to drill in a bit more on kind of, we've talked about the pros of fractional, but can we talk about the other side? What cons might come with that?
yeah, definitely. I could talk a little bit about my experience on the leadership side. I mentioned obviously like there's cost savings on absolute dollar amount. Like prorated. Like I probably got paid more. But you're a startup, you only have a few $1,000,000 in the bank. Saving 100 grand, 200 grand is not trivial, right? And especially now in today's climate, extending runway and just like staying alive is sort of the name of the game, especially if you're a startup, or if you're not a startup, but just being more efficient with your capital. And like I said, it buys you time and potentially expertise out of reach. There's a lot of fractional CTOs out there, right? Maybe who have led like major companies with really deep technical knowledge. Like you're probably not going to be able to get them to join your startup, but maybe they would do it fractionally, whether it's advising or helping you with a certain project, something like that. And definitely like you can hire more quickly because the stakes are a little bit lower. Like obviously you don't want to ever make a bad hire, but hiring some like who's fractional or interim or something like that, there's a little less risk than if you're full-time. There's benefits. It just feels like it's a far less liquid sort of arrangement. And there's a lot more kind of strings tied to that. So it allows you to be a little more agile and make quicker decisions, which I think is really important. The cons, I think, at least on the leadership side, Praveen, I think kind of gave a good counterpoint that fractional can be long-term. At least on the leadership side, it usually is not a long-term situation. Like if you're trying to be a growing startup, not everyone should be fractional forever. And I think a big thing is like a key contention is like, it's not worth the overhead. And I think that is true if your onboarding's not good, right? Like you're not going to hire someone fractionally for like 2 weeks and then like get rid of them, right? But like if you can ramp somebody really quickly, regardless of the role, it just, again, lets you be much more efficient in your hiring. So I think, regardless of whether you're at a big company, a tiny company, like onboarding is key. So it lets you be more agile with your hiring. And the last thing that I experienced fractionally, I couldn't really be in the trenches, right? So like I realized at a certain point, I actually needed to be like writing some code, not because they needed my output, but because there were some problems I was starting to lose a little bit of touch with. But I just didn't have the capacity to do that. I leaned on some more senior folks to kind of get more help from them. But I think I was very upfront with the leadership, the CEO and the team, like, hey, like this is something I'm not going to be able to do, but this is something that you will need from your next hire. And so the next head of engineering had that expectation kind of coming in. So yeah, that was like one downside in this specific case. You don't, if you're only working 10, 20 hours, you're not going to get into all the little minutia, and you have to really use your leverage and your experience. So yeah, there's at least from like the leadership perspective, there's some of the things I saw. And just one other general point, like a lot of this is not engineering specific, right? Like definitely there are some domain specific things, but I think you can kind of apply this to like any professional role and any kind of fractional leader.
Yeah, it's interesting and extending beyond from your personal experience, Ernie, was on the leadership side. So my experience personally, back when I used to do this, this was like 15 years ago, which it's sort of it's a funny story. I'll tell it because it's a funny story. But so I was employed in the mid 2000s at Oracle, and I was a sales engineer. And if I'm really brutally honest, what happened was that I had moved from New York to Atlanta. So I was working on Wall Street as an independent consultant. But there were and are, I believe, a lot of jobs on the street, as they call it, that are full-time contract, like long-term contracts, multi-year contracts. So you're never actually an employee, you're just a contractor and you get paid hourly or maybe a day rate. And so that was what I was doing. And I get down to Atlanta and I find that my finance experience is not as valuable in Atlanta as it is in New York. This being the mid 2000s, there's no such thing really as remote work, not so much. So I also think at that time, I'm like, you know what? I think I want to start a company again, because it had been a few years since I'd been a founder, and I want to take another try. So I looked for a job literally where I thought I would have some spare time. I got a contract. Now the thing was, I had to fly once a month because this is that was the nature of my full-time job, and so I got into the contract. Now, this being 2006 or something like that, I was going to an office in Atlanta to do this consulting role. I worked really hard for 3 weeks, showed that I knew what I was doing and I could write code to solve a lot of their problems. And then by the time I said, hey guys, I actually have some other work going on, on the side. And so if you're cool with it, I'd love to keep on working with you, but this is how it's going to have to be. It actually worked. So I found myself, kind of juggling roles in that way and juggling some consulting work with a full-time job. So I came from sort of like doing it as an individual contributor. And so naturally in my mind, I was like, okay, if I can do it, I'm sure there's lots of others that can do it. So that was the in the trenches role. But what we came to find, like speaking of what you were talking about, Ernie, in terms of hours, in our experimentation at HiddenLevers, so we started, now that was my experience in the mid 2000s. So fast forward, I start a company, start hiring fractional engineers. We found that as an individual contributor, that it usually takes around 20 hours a week. Because like you said, like when you're only there, like only working on something for 10 hours a week, it's hard to keep up with what's going on, particularly at a startup where it's a fast moving environment. So, so 20 hours is where we found like actually kind of a sweet spot where a lot of the developers that we were working with back then and that we work with, with the company today, that they have that amount of capacity available. And it's enough time for them to get into a problem pretty deep, and actually write code and produce, actually push PRs and be part of sort of the whole dev lifecycle, and that can work. Down in the 10-hour range, we found that, like you said, it's kind of probably more guidance, maybe architectural, more high level kind of expertise and experience.
Yeah.
And if I were to say other pros and cons, like we found that just in terms of what kind of worked, in the individual contributor role. So to Ernie, to your point about other roles, we had marketing was fractional at HiddenLevers, and customer success to some extent, not mostly. I mean, most of the customer success folks were full-time, but a little bit of that. So we actually tried this model in lots of different roles and found that, yeah, it actually can work in lots of functions. We just found that it was very high value add in software development precisely because senior developers are both well compensated and rightly so, but also hard to find.
Well, very interesting. So, we talked a lot about, your individual experiences being fractional devs, but Praveen, I want to talk a little bit more about managing fractional teams. How does it work? I think you were talking a little bit about that, but could you expand a bit more?
Yeah, so it's been interesting because now running a company that sort of we're specializing in providing fractional software developers, and we do a little bit of fractional CTO work as well. As we've done, I think we have 3 clients where they, brought on fractional CTOs. But most of it is software developers, and we had some learnings. I would say early on, we thought, well, let's build a fractional developer marketplace where companies can come on and they can find their, a developer that has the skills that they need and just be off and running. What we realized pretty quickly was we can vet for, senior talent with lots of good expertise, and we've done that. We can apply strict screening measures to make sure that every developer really can write code and they do it for a living. And we can find, we can assess whether or not they've got the independence and initiative needed. And we can make sure that contractually, and that's important, that contractually, all the legal ownership of the code can rest with the client, right? That they don't have any restrictions in their employment agreements. So we could do all of that. But if we just handed off the developer to the end client at that point, we still saw some gaps. And so we realized, we need to take a team approach here. And so that was one of our learnings, was that there is some, I don't know if it's secret sauce, but just some knowledge base that we developed working with fractional developers over a decade in terms of how to, do a good job of managing and making sure that expectations are met. Because a lot of their code is not being written during the day. We ensure that they're able to make, a handful of meetings during the business day, but a lot of their code is being written when they have time. And so just making sure that that feedback process works. And while they are typically on client Slack or Teams so that they can be communicative, just making sure that those lines of communication stay open. And honestly, a lot of it's the same as it is with remote developers, remote full-time developers. At HiddenLevers, we had a long-time remote full-time developer who was a heck of a lot harder to reach than my fractional guys. And so, some of that's just person by person. But anyway, so some of that learning how to manage that process is what we realized that we needed to apply, and have definitely invested in that with the delivery model that we use today, where we kind of back up every developer with not just project management. That's what it says on the slide, but really it's sort of lightweight product management, because as often as not, I find that if you think about like the notion of a so-called 10x engineer, I think quite often that 10x comes from like not writing better code, but by asking the right questions and actually ending up solving the correct problem. So reframing the problem is a huge part of that productivity boost. So we try to help with that, and help with guidance to kind of improve that productivity, and then we absolutely look to have super high quality developers that we're working with that can bring a lot to the table too. But it's a team approach, and that helps us ensure success. And then every now and then maybe I have to play Harvey Keitel, if the scene, if anybody remembers that Pulp Fiction scene, but hopefully it's not too often if we're getting it right.
Cool, awesome. Well, it's good to know that we're taking a more innovative approach to fractional work. But yeah, learning a little bit more about fractional work itself. Can we talk a bit about who is a fractional person? Who is a fractional developer?
Yeah, Praveen, you wanna take it first?
Well, if we start on the left there, I mean, we tried very hard. So that's a picture of the actual HiddenLevers office. That must have been the early days, Alicia, because we don't have the HiddenLevers logo on that wall yet.
Yeah, I think
Wow.
that was when we first moved in.
Yeah, that's like a move. That's like a move-in day picture almost. But yeah, so that was at our offices. We would, in terms of like how we did dev and how we ran our sprints and how the fractional developers were involved. So the fractional developers definitely had areas of expertise based on what they were bringing to the table. So one of our longest tenured developers, I think I mentioned Suhail, he was our integrations dev. So he over the course of almost 9 years, like I said, he wrote and maintained 25 different partner integrations. So it was fairly substantial, the amount of work that he was able to do and to keep up with over that time. And as that load grew, of course, he was working with full-time devs in providing, in helping maintain that body. It got so complex by the end. So yeah, so there would sort of be freely mixing kind of work between the functions. We found that it worked for lots of different roles. So we had integration dev, we did that way, front end like UI components, a lot of like PDF generation and reports, and so all kinds of different areas of the software where fractional developers were working alongside full-time developers, and we were just assigning the Jira tasks out, and going through that process, and we found it worked well. It's the labels on the picture don't do it justice. Actually, what would have done it justice, Alicia, is if we had a picture of one of our offsites, because we invited our fractional devs to our offsites. And if they could make it, they made it, and sometimes they enjoyed that. They would actually take the holiday from their day job so they could be part of the team and like get to come out to Asheville and other places that we went, New York once. So that was the extent to which we included them, and we felt like they were really part of the long-term team. And now in terms of the who is, most of the fractional developers that we worked with had day jobs. We did have one, in the HiddenLevers era that was, she was a mom. And so she was, working part-time and felt that was good balance for her. Fast forward to today with Fraction, the company, and working with a pool that's, I think we're, around 100 developers deep today, and counting. And we see all sorts. Just one fun anecdote around that was that I think it was last week, I was interviewing Flutter developers, and two of the developers were essentially near retirement, but they wanted to stay engaged. And they're mobile developers using Flutter, and so why not be able to continue to contribute with that skill? So we certainly see folks from all walks. How about you, Ernie? Is that you've talked to so many people, you're kind of like the face of the movement now. So what have you seen?
Man, my face is the cat's out, the Pandora's box is open. I'm on Google image search. So No, yeah. So one of the cool parts about work on this news is that I've just been able to talk to a lot of different people. So I was on Good Morning America because they stole the story from Wall Street Journal. So I think a lot of people are like me, right? They're looking for more balance. I just had, like I said, my second child, young family. My wife is working full time. There's just a lot going on in my life. I'm able to volunteer now with like foster youth, work on the farm, spend more time with my parents. Like there's a lot of stuff in my life that's important. But I still have these skills I want to offer. Like I'm like in my 30s. I'm not trying to retire, nor can I. So it's really important for me to stay sharp, to stay ambitious, curious, but also have that balance, right? So I think there's a lot of people like myself, really family oriented people. A contractor that actually I worked with at Arcade, he works fractionally in the sense of he works 6 months on, 6 months off, and he's an artist. There's more people like that. There's people who have other hobbies. They're runners. They're like high level athletes, or they just like to stay fit or whatever. I got a ton of emails from people who are retirees after the Wall Street Journal article ran about me. People are saying, "Oh, this is great. Like I'm retired, but like I need to do something. I'm gonna go crazy." Right. And there's some people who just like you said, Praveen, like they have a day job. They're just trying to hustle, or they're just bored doing only one job. They want to learn more. They want to get more exposure to things or just earn more income. All that to just say, like, it's a very diverse group. And I think the like message I'd want to convey is like, it's a diverse group, and you're going to be able to find people across like the talent and skills spectrum. It's not people who are just lazy, right? Which maybe that's a little bit of a straw man, but I've definitely kind of seen like little rumblings of that kind of a thing here and there. Don't go read the comments of newspaper articles, but yeah, it's a truly kind of wide mix. Actually, one more I'll throw in there. I actually forgot to mention this. When I was at Arcade, I actually hired someone 30 hours a week. He actually reached out to me about my newsletter, but he said he just gotten laid off from a 4-day week job. And I was like, like you seem like you actually have the right. I screened him for 30 minutes. I just said, hey, let's do a 1-month contract to hire at a reasonable like rate, prorated. After a month, they were like, yeah, he's great. Boom. 30 hours a week. Yeah, it doesn't really make a difference to like 40 hours. Like you just cut your day off a little earlier and you just make sure you're here for the core hours. It worked perfectly. I didn't have to pay a recruiter. This was one of the quickest hires we made. And because he was already not working, but he was a younger guy, but it was important for him. He had I think he liked to surf. I don't know if you have like connotations of a surfer dude, but he wanted to surf and he wanted to work. So like I was able to make that hire, and he's been a great developer for this company. No recruiting fees. And the key differentiator we had was we fit his lifestyle. So I think there's a lot of opportunities like this out there for companies to get talent that it might otherwise be hard, right? Like Arcade is great, but like, I don't know if they have that quite differentiator right now on paper that would have gotten this guy to pick them versus some other startup, but that was what kind of pushed it over the edge. So yeah, hopefully that provides a little context on what I'm seeing, and maybe give folks who are hiring or wanting to work with fractional people like a little more insight into like the kind of, I guess, like the kind of mindset behind it.
Right. Yeah. And if I would expand, Ernie, you mentioned, because there definitely, I think there's an element of it's a cool story, which is why, WSJ and then Good Morning America picked up on it, because it is really exciting to see. But from the other standpoint, that we do see a lot of developers that it's interesting. They're at big companies. They're getting a little bored, maybe mid-career, 10, 12, even, 15 years in. So they've got these skills. And one of the archetypes that we've seen quite often is senior developers who either they don't want to try to go into management, or that's just not a skill set that they have or have an interest in. So they're not really management material, but they don't really have a ton of promotion ahead where they are in their career if they don't enter management. So given that, they are kind of feeling stuck in their career. But at the same time, they're doing pretty well maybe at their job. They've gotten to a point where they can probably do their job in such a way that they've got some surplus capacity. And but they're risk averse. Like, joining a startup would involve probably taking a step back on comp, taking a risk. A lot of folks at that point in their career, maybe they have family and they can't afford to take the risk of a startup going under on them. So that's why the model, I think, that we put together with Fraction, appeals to them. A lot of these developers are already doing gig work on the side, or or trying to. What we found appealing in our pitch to them is that they they're excited about the actually the opportunity to work with startups and to apply their skills to kind of something more exciting, maybe than working for a big telco or just even frankly, a big tech company. And it's worth noting that more and more companies, meaning big companies, explicitly carve out and allow their employees to work, outside of their hours, and as long as it's non-competitive. So we've seen that Microsoft made an announcement actually last summer where they said that they were not enforcing non-competes below the director level. So this is becoming more and more common. Microsoft, all of the California-based tech, kind of mega cap companies, by law, they're not allowed to in the state of California enforce non-competes in that way, and so they don't, for this most part, they don't bother to enforce it anywhere. And so we're seeing a lot of that there's a lot of opportunity in sort of the legal framework of employment agreements, and then there's a lot of interest in it from those workers. And so I would say that that's probably the majority of our pool. And of course, there are also folks coming from all sorts of backgrounds, but just want to throw that in there.
Yeah. Sorry. One last point I just wanted to make. I've gotten a couple like really touching messages from folks who actually have like significant health problems and they can't work full time, but they can work remotely, partially, and but they need like this extreme flexibility. So, I feel like the tech industry likes to talk a lot about inclusion, but like this is one way that can like actually really make a difference in some people's lives and keep them in the workforce where otherwise they'd have to just leave. So there's that little bit to it as well.
Yeah, no, and that's huge because fundamentally the workforce shortage is a big issue. So anything, all of you, if you were to combine all of these different opportunities that a lot of the groups of folks that you mentioned are looking for, Ernie, and then combine that with folks that want to work more. I always thought it was funny that corporate America, it's a 9 to 5, and it's sort of looked down on that someone would moonlight. But in startup world, like 50, 60 hours is sort of like pretty common. So clearly the capacity is there. There's lots of people. And then if you think about the medical world, don't even talk to medical residents. Apparently 80 to 100 hours is common. So it's not like there are some folks at some points in their life that aren't capable of more. And, so across the spectrum, I think there's opportunity to tap into all those folks.
Yeah, definitely. So really exciting to hear that with fractional work, employers can tap into an untouched source, basically. So can we talk about where we can find fractional talent?
Yeah, so I could speak to a lot of this. As I've kind of been working on the newsletter, I've kind of learned a lot more about what the market really looks like. Obviously, first, just start with networking, right? Like sometimes like the best person you find is just like word of mouth. Hey, who's the best person you've worked with that knows about XYZ, right? I feel like especially if you're starting a startup, you should always start there. Pre-product market fit, you should be trying to find people who can work really cash efficiently as you're figuring out what even you're doing before plunking, 100K plus equity, 200, whatever. And then realizing, oh, actually in 6 months, we're a totally different company. So we're gonna have to fire you, or we're stuck with you, right? Like really start with that networking, be really nimble. There are a lot of marketplaces out there of, I'll say, varying quality and of varying types of engagements. Some are really good. Some maybe are like, you just got to find the one that fits for you. The one piece of advice I'd give is find like the niche that matches what you're looking for. There's, like Upwork exists for like little gigs, really. It can do some bigger work, but it's probably not the highest quality if you're like looking for a marketer. Maybe you should go to Marketer Hire, right? For that sort of a thing, or like Fast CTO. So those exist. And one thing I'm trying to do with the newsletter is like start to curate all these things and different places, marketplaces, so you can find that. So kind of be on the lookout for that. And then of course there's Fraction. So I'll kick it off to Praveen on that one.
Sure. Yeah. And we find, I would say that when we started, we thought, oh, maybe we're going to be another marketplace. And we found that the model to work really well, like I said before, we bring a little bit more to the table in terms of how we manage and deliver. But what we're finding is the following. Unlike, say, the Upwork and sort of the gig kind of economy, what worked well for us at HiddenLevers is what we're trying to bring to the market, which is hopefully open-ended long-term engagements with these fractional developers. We work on monthly contracts. We're trying to kind of make our product as SaaS-like as possible. So it's all fixed pricing, and it's very clear, on our website that there's plans, SaaS style, where you can just pick. But what we're finding is that these senior developers, when they're presented with an opportunity to engage with a a startup or with the growing company over a longer period of time, we're actually able to find some flexibility in their, compensation asks, because they so when they go on, let's say the Upworks of the world or any gig site, they feel like they've got to charge their highest marginal rate. And the reason that they're doing that is because the process of interviewing and finding the next gig, it's really onerous. It's really tiring. And so we're trying to eliminate that by getting them in place where they're working for many months or even years with the same company. And so in when they hear that, and when they hear that, we don't, so Fraction, by rule and by principle, we don't track hours. It's not about hours, it's about productivity. So our contracts are monthly. So if a client ever sees productivity falling off, they're free to go elsewhere. But we prove ourselves every single month. The delivery and the productivity has to be there. And developers really appreciate that it's not about like a timesheet or punching a clock. No, it's about productivity. Did they get the work done? And so they appreciate all of those things, so that we've been able to find that the developers that we work with, many of them are actually working for at or below the hourly rate that their full-time job pays. And we're able to kind of pass that along to clients. And so that it's a really quite an effective model from a cost perspective. But again, that has to do with the philosophy and making sure that it's not gig work, that they're part of a team, and they feel like they're part of the team, and they feel like it could, have the potential to be a long-term relationship with a company.
Yeah. The last thing I'll just add is I have like over 100 profiles through my newsletter of like not just developers, but like marketers, sales folks, go-to-market folks, people who've been execs, like that just have like expressed interest in working fractionally. So if you're looking to hire like anything, like feel free to just shoot me an email. I'm happy to try to connect you with somebody. But I'm also just like a big fan of what Praveen and Fraction are doing, just in terms of like being smarter about like how you employ some of that fractional talent. Certainly independent consultants can work and has worked before. But I think what Praveen and company are doing like de-risks and like brings a lot of the best learnings to a lot of things, so that you're getting more bang for your buck. So
yeah, and Ernie, I'm curious, so Part-Time Tech is, your platform for your explorations in the fractional world. So like, I don't know if you've got some concepts on vision there and like where you're taking it.
yeah, I'll be quick because I can meander for a long time on this. The thing I've learned is like there are marketplaces, but like just a straight up job board is really hard for this sort of a thing, for reasons you explained, but also it's like people don't look for fractional help like regularly, like a normal job and like application. And I don't think that's the way a lot of this market's going to go. What I'm considering is like, can I make a community of people in my readership who maybe want to form these like businesses or agencies or things kind of together, right? Of people who are like-minded, as well as for people who want to work fractional, like can I also point them to hey, go work. If you want to be a developer, like you can go work with Fraction, or here's this like marketing contact I have. And then just being sort of the one-stop shop for both talent and for businesses looking to work or to hire fractionally to like find their way. Because really the hardest thing about this world is like a lot of it's just credibility, right? Like, can I trust this agency or this whatever that I hire? And if I can kind of lend some credibility, some guardrails, best practices, and some trust to that, that would be really cool, and to kind of be in that position. But yeah, a lot of ideas.
Yeah, and it's awesome. I think that this is such a big space that, and the idea of fractional work is sort of so new that anything that, those of us who are kind of in this area, we can kind of push this future of work forward, and we'll all benefit by it, because it's frankly, I look at it as almost the polar opposite of the last startup, that worked on. We mentioned HiddenLevers. That was a niche where we're selling to a very specific audience, and that's, got its own positives, but it was limited in its size. And here, I mean, the sky's the limit, I think, with the whole workforce, changing over time. So
Absolutely.
So yeah, I think you both made some great points there. Looks like we've got a good number of questions, so I want to make sure we have enough time to go through that. So apologies, audience. I'm a new user to Zoom, so we couldn't get to your questions earlier. So
you want to just read them, Alicia, or?
Yeah, so Matthew earlier had asked, did the acquirers have concerns about whether the business system they were buying would be stable if some critical people were fractional? And follow
It's a
up,
good, yeah. Mhm.
are they already fractional, or do you convince them to go down from a full-time job? So I guess two-part question to Praveen.
Sure, yeah. And so I would answer that. No, actually, our acquirers had no concerns about the notion of fractional, and frankly, they never even asked. So I think that my concrete response to that, having gone through sort of the due diligence process, is that there's like 8,000 balls in the air whenever a company is doing a major like M&A transaction and due diligence, and I think like all of 5 seconds were spent on like, oh, these are the employees. Oh, these people are part time. Oh, okay, that's cool. That was the extent of it. The only what they were concerned about, which has nothing to do with fractional versus full time, was what percentage of your team will sign these papers saying that they are coming across with the transaction, just officially sign their new offer letters, and we'll make special ones that work for consultants, for the people that are consultants. And then once they saw those signatures, they're like, okay, yeah, we're cool. And that had nothing to do again with fractional versus full time. They were that never even came up. In terms of were the folks already fractional, or do we convince them to go down from a full time job? So most of the folks we were working with, like I had said, I think they had full time jobs and they were bolting this on. They were just in the market, if you will, for more than 40 hours of work. So that was kind of the case for most of the folks that we worked with, and it is also true today. But there's a substantial percentage of folks in our case today, and then even back then, 20-25%, who are solely looking for 20 or maybe 30 hours a week.
Great, thanks. This one I'll give to Ernie. So Ernie, we have a question from Irma. Are there certain types of companies or types of teams where hiring fractionally is most successful?
Yeah, so I guess I'll just answer this like generally, not just like specifically for engineers. I think we sort of touched on this at various points, but I think one is like truly like it's sort of ironic because counterintuitive, because it's like fractionally means you're working less hours, but like in order to do that, you need to focus sort of on the results rather than just the hours. So I think a company and a culture that cares about that, it's really important. Another piece is just being able to be efficient with your overhead, right? Like if you have someone working 20 or 30 hours a week, your tolerance for like the level of like BS and meetings and like all the corporate stuff that people don't like has to go down. Or yeah, your tolerance for it goes down, because you can't afford to be on like pointless Zoom meetings and like that could have been in emails and those sorts of things, right? So I think it really pushes an emphasis on efficient communication, being more asynchronous where possible, companies that are very kind of forward thinking in that sense, as well as onboarding well, right? If you think someone's going to work fewer hours, then you got to believe that you can, again, less overhead, onboarding, meetings, that sort of a thing. The last thing I'll say is I think culture is just huge. So the analogy I've been giving folks recently is, so at HubSpot, we had unlimited vacation. Now, unlimited vacation gets like really kind of, excuse my language, but gets kind of shit on a lot in the tech world, and probably honestly for good reason, right? It's like people take advantage of it. It's like, oh, I took 2 days of vacation this year with my unlimited vacation. I didn't get paid out my vacation days when I quit. But at HubSpot, actually, I took a ton of vacation, and all the teams I managed always did. So I loved unlimited vacation. It was flexible, but it was because we had a culture that encouraged it. And where I'm going with this is like, I think fractional work, there's an analogy there where like the focus has to be on productivity, like, and not your time. And I think when you have companies that think in that way, you're set up to be more successful. Because at the end of the day, it's like, even full-time jobs, like, is it actually 40 hours? It's like, not really, right? Like your sense of someone being productive or not, like, unless you're building widgets, is not really based on time. It's kind of a gut feeling. It's your experience based on working with people like this and relative to this or that, and then just going for outcomes. So I think I clearly get a feel for that. Like when you talk, Praveen, like, I don't think there was a micromanaging of the hours and like, did you push this many tickets? So it's like, no, like, were you productive? And it's like, yeah, if you're working 20 hours a week, you'll be roughly half as productive as a full-time person, but we're not going to micromanage the minutia as long as you're doing a good job and like, seems like you're at your level. So I kind of went on a rant there, but I think hopefully that kind of embodies that question in like a more of like a philosophical way. But that's a good question, Irma.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, we actually see that halftime productivity for halftime work is, our general model with Fraction, because like I said earlier, we found that halftime is roughly the, the structure that works for individual contributors. But what we see in practice is that a lot of the folks are actually producing, and this is what we saw from our own stats, what we would measure at my last startup. The average productivity is higher than 50%. And I think that has to do with the fact that a lot of, like, when you're in a full-time role, there's a certain amount of, to Ernie's point, pointless meetings and other kind of not necessarily productive time usage as you go up in time. And in that more limited time, it actually ended up being slightly maybe better utilized. So yeah, we're seeing like 65% be quite common in terms of productivity relative to the official amount of time, which actually just kind of lends to the overall kind of value we think in the model. But there was another question that's, I guess, specifically for me. Have you seen fractional devs contribute code? Hopefully it was obvious, or if it wasn't obvious from my previous answers, absolutely yes. And in our model, that's the vast majority of what we do, is that these developers are writing code. That's all they're doing, is writing code. Of course, providing their feedback on when they think maybe the direction isn't quite perfect. But yeah, it's writing code. That's what they do. And our expectation is that in the first 2 weeks, where we kind of do like a risk-free trial type of a period with any new developer and new client, that they will have stood up their dev environment and CI/CD and all of that, and that they will have, pushed a PR, if you're in the GitHub model, or that they will have written code and committed it and gotten it pushed, whether that's to test or stage or all the way to prod, depending on the release cycle. So yeah, absolutely. Writing code is the whole point.
Definitely seeing some real productivity. Okay. A question from Jose. So what can companies do to get productive with fractional devs? Seems like there's some setup required to make sure they are productive.
Well, Ernie, you hired several recently. So what was the experience at Arcade?
Yeah, I don't think it's honestly that. So I kind of touched on this before. I think again, gets down to onboarding, reducing overhead, and also just managing expectations, right? I guess this can go back to Irma's question as well before about which companies or teams are hiring fractionally works best, but you just got to make sure it's a setup that makes sense, right? Where, like you wouldn't have someone that needs to be on call, maybe working fractionally, and then like they leave the pager for 2 days or something obvious like that. But yeah, I think maybe the best example I can give of this, I spoke to Sahil Lavingia. He's the founder of Gumroad, and he runs his company completely with part-time employees. Now, whether you think they're a great company or not a great company, leave it up to you. But one thing he said that was really interesting is he wants their code base to be like an open source project, where someone just like goes into GitHub, do you read the README, you like check out the code, poke around, you're like, oh yeah, I can throw up a change immediately, right? And that depends on good documentation, standards, practices. So I think that's really, really key to make a dev feel at home, where they can kind of come in and it's like not everything is super bespoke, custom, crazy. Like the more you can make it kind of out of the box, like an open source project, I think that sets devs up for success. And then, yeah, just making sure the expectations on set are what are they expected to deliver? How are they going to work with other fractional or other full-time folks? What are the expectations there? It's sort of management 101 type stuff. And it's not that different than a full-time person. You just kind of got to contextualize it there.
Great. Awesome. Thank you. I know we're running short on time, so maybe we'll take 1 or 2 more questions. We have this question from Neil. Do you hire the fractional devs one by one, or can you find 2 to 3 that know/work together as fractional devs to be almost a fractional team?
Well, in our case, we, and Alicia, you know this well, but we have done both. We recently stood up a team that started out with just a fractional, kind of a hands-on fractional CTO, meaning he was writing code, but also was sort of the tech leadership at a firm that had an Eastern European, they had an offshore team in Eastern Europe. And what happened was that they had great success with the first fractional CTO hire. So in the end, they've added 2 more fractional senior developers, and they are rolling off the Eastern European kind of offshore team that they have. So they're going forward, their entire dev organization, and actually this is similar to Gumroad, but their whole dev organization is composed of 3 fractional US-based engineers. The finding in their case, and what we found working with them, is that, excuse me, when you put together all senior engineers, that helps with productivity. And when you kind of eliminate some of the friction hurdles that come maybe with offshore work and bring it closer, and then we put a little bit of a management layer to try to help ensure progress is continuing. Well, they were seeing more productivity, or are seeing more productivity, from 3 fractional US-based engineers than from a team of 4 that was offshore in Eastern Europe, and that was 4 full time. So the leverage, we feel like, can be pretty enormous.
Yeah, the only thing I'll just add there is, like, this is something I want to experiment with part-time tech, is like, can I get some of these folks to just like form their own teams, right? Like, in some sense, it's just like building your own agency, but it's sort of like a different bent to it. I'm curious to see if that'll work. But I mean, I know, like, if some of the best people I've worked with at past jobs were like, hey, let's like work together, I'd be like, oh, I would love to, right? Like, handpick the best people that you already work well with and jive with. That's sort of the dream, right? So yeah.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. So this is for both Ernie and Praveen. There's been a lot of talk about fractional software engineers. Where else does fractional employment make sense?
If I shoot real quick, and then Ernie, I'll let you pick it up, I will say that from personal experience, works really well for marketing. And then I think I had mentioned before, marketing and customer success in certain ops roles, we found, success with, directly. And then I'll say, just more generally, that CFO work has been done like this forever. So that's sort of a well-established principle. But Ernie, any other thoughts there?
Yeah, the one thing I'll say is, this might actually show up in like the next podcast I have coming out, but like anything that's like more like Q-like work, like obviously, like, we're not building widgets like I mentioned before, but like anything that can be more like that is obviously lends itself a little easier. But I would say, like, any role can be fractional if it's in the right context. And by context, I mean the stage of your company and like what you need. I think if you're, like I said before, if you're pre-product market fit, like a fractional PM might even make sense, right? Granted, maybe your founder should probably be your PM, but like there are different times where any role can be fractional. Like if you're experimenting, are you trying to spin up a new line of business, but you're just like exploring it? Maybe you hire like a small team around that, right? So really, I think it could be anything. What I'd emphasize is, like, think of it like a tool in your toolbox, like any other. The default is to reach for the full-time hammer, right? But like, why not just look at all the tools you have in terms of like employee arrangements, and then consider which one fits what you need at this time and your budget and what your company needs for every role. So that would just kind of be like my soapbox, I guess.
Okay, great. And we're just about at the hour. So for anyone whose question wasn't answered, we'll go ahead and just respond directly after our session. But yeah, thank you everyone for your time. Praveen and Ernie, appreciate you coming on and sharing your insight and your experience. And thank you to our audience who stayed with us through the entire time. We appreciate your attendance. If you'd like to learn more, please feel free to reach out to the emails below for Fraction or for part-time tech. And yeah, I think we're wrapping up for today. So thank you again, and we'll see you guys at the next webinar.